Henry I had secured from the barons an oath to recognize his daughter Matilda as his successor, but after his death her cousin Stephen obtained the crown in 1135. The Scotch king and many English nobles asserted the superior rights of Matilda, and a civil war ensued which lasted for 17 years. During this time the king lost all control of the country, and the power passed into the hands of the feudal nobles. The latter engaged in many private wars and wasted the kingdom, so that famines followed in some counties. They also seized the property of private citizens and used torture to extort money from their victims. They hanged up men by the feet and smoked them with foul smoke. They put knotted strings about men's heads and twisted the strings till they entered the brain. Many thousands they starved. This period of anarchy was ended by the Peace of Wallingford in 1153, when Stephen was recognized as king by the party of Matilda, with the condition that her son Henry should receive the crown after Stephen's death. The following year, Henry II succeeded to the throne. In addition to England, he ruled over Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, which he had inherited. By his marriage with Eleanor, formerly the wife of Louis VII of France, he secured Aquitaine. Thus his French possessions were more extensive than his English kingdom, and for a time there was a possibility that England would be merely a subject country ruled by a French monarch. The danger to the French king has been discussed. Fortunately for the development of England, almost all of these foreign possessions were lost during the reign of John. In the British Islands, on the other hand, the possessions of the Angevin kings became much more extensive. One of the popes, Adrian IV, is said to have made a grant of Ireland to Henry. Whether this is true or not, the latter made an expedition to that island in 1171, and during a brief stay received the submission of the Irish kings. Probably the real reason for his expedition was the growing power of Norman lords, who, dissatisfied with his rule, had left England and were attempting to establish independent principalities in Ireland. This so-called conquest gave the English kings a claim to Ireland, but the later kings paid little attention to that country, and the real conquest and incorporation did not take place until the reign of Elizabeth, 1558 to 1603. Henry II also became overlord of Wales by the submission of the Welsh rulers. The overlordship was claimed by the succeeding kings, and was generally recognized until the time of Edward I. But the Welsh were constantly plundering the English borderlands, and joined in every movement against the king. Llewellyn, Prince of Wales, refused for some years to do homage to Edward, and even after acknowledging that he was the king's vassal, made war upon the latter. A long conflict followed, in which the Welsh, aided by the mountainous character of their country, made a stubborn resistance, but were subjugated in 1283. In the following year, Edward II was born in their land and received the title of Prince of Wales, which is still borne by the eldest son of the King of England. The Angevin kings also claimed the overlordship of Scotland, as William the Conqueror and William Rufus had both received the homage of the Scottish kings, and in 1137 King David of Scotland had aided Matilda as her vassal. The Scottish monarchs did homage to Henry II, but Richard the Lion-hearted sold his rights as overlord when he needed money for his crusade. On the death of Margaret, the heiress to the Scotch throne, in 1290, several relatives laid claim to the succession, and Edward I was asked to decide which was the lawful heir. He asserted the right of overlordship which Richard had abandoned, and his authority was recognized by most of the claimants and by many of the nobles. John Balliol was made king by Edward, but soon became irritated because he found that he was treated merely as a vassal of the English monarch, who kept the effective power in his own hands. Consequently, Balliol revolted in 1295 and made an alliance with the French king. War followed in 1296. Balliol was captured, the country was conquered, and an English governor was appointed. In fact, Scotland seemed to be incorporated into Edward's possessions. But in 1297 the Scotch revolted again under William Wallace. After a victory at Stirling, a defeat at Falkirk, and various other battles, he was captured and executed in 1305. The next year Robert Bruce headed another revolt. The death of Edward I in 1307 and the weakness of Edward II enabled Bruce to gain the mastery of almost all Scotland, and his victory at Bannockburn in 1314 practically secured the independence of Scotland, which was recognized by the English in the Treaty of Northampton, 1323. The English kings made some attempts later to regain Scotland, but these were of little consequence. William the Conqueror had favoured the clergy and had added to the power of the Church in England, but he was in no way subservient to the papacy. He refused to do homage to Gregory VII. He forbade appeals to Rome. He allowed no papal legate to land in the kingdom without his permission, and ecclesiastical laws had to receive his sanction before they became operative in England. Henry I wished to keep the same authority, and refused to give up the right of investing church officials. But a compromise was reached in 1107, similar to that arranged by the Concordat of Worms. In the period of civil war, however, the Church obtained great power, as there was no effective opposition from Stephen or Matilda. When Henry II became king, he desired to regain the authority over the Church which William had wielded. Accordingly, he appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury his chancellor and most intimate friend, Thomas Becket. But the latter at once became the champion of the Church, and attempted to assert his freedom from royal control. Open conflict was avoided, however, until the king promulgated the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164. By these laws, appeals to Rome without the king's permission were forbidden. The king's consent was declared to be necessary for the election of bishops and abbots. Clerics were in certain cases to be punished by the royal courts. Estates held by the Church were to pay the same dues as lay fiefs, and a villain was not to receive ordination without his lord's consent. Becket resisted the enforcement of these laws and was forced to go into exile. In 1170 he returned and again provoked the anger of the king. Some followers of Henry, acting upon rash words which he uttered, murdered Thomas in Canterbury Cathedral. The general indignation of the people compelled Henry, who regretted that his anger had led to the murder, to rescind the constitutions and to do penance for the murder. Later, however, he succeeded in obtaining many of the powers which he desired. When the Archbishopric of Canterbury became vacant in 1205, during John's reign, a double election took place, and both parties appealed to the Pope, Innocent III. The latter set aside both candidates, one of whom was nominated by John, and had Stephen Langton elected. As John refused to accept Stephen, Innocent placed England under an interdict in 1208, and the following year excommunicated the king. The latter remained obdurate, and was threatened with deposition by the Pope in 1213. The people of England were so incensed by John's tyranny that he was compelled to yield to the Pope in order to keep his kingdom, and to submit to the most humiliating conditions, acknowledging himself to be a papal vassal, receiving Langton, and promising to pay a large sum each year as a recognition of the Pope's overlordship. During the period of misrule in the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, the popes treated England as a papal territory, exacting contributions and appointing hundreds of foreigners to church offices. In 1252, Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln, stated that the officials nominated by the Pope were enjoying revenues in England which were 3 times as great as the king's income. Edward I, 1272 1307, endeavoured to restrict the power of the clergy. In 1279 he made a law forbidding gifts of estates to the Church, because the lands which it held were free from the payment of feudal dues. He refused to submit to the authority claimed by Boniface VIII in 1296. 10 years later he forbade members of the Church to pay contributions which were to be used outside the realm. Without openly breaking with the Pope, he did all in his power to lessen the papal influence and authority over the Church in England. When Henry II became king in 1154, he set about the re-establishment of the royal authority, which had been weakened in the long civil war. The constitutions of Clarendon, by which he endeavoured to restrict the powers of the Church, have been discussed. His other laws, which were called assizes, were intended to lessen the authority of the feudal lords, and may be divided into 2 general classes. Those of the first class built up a national army, in contrast with the feudal levies on which the king had been obliged to depend. Henry secured money to hire mercenaries, by levying frequently a tax called scutage, instead of calling upon the barons to perform their military service. This resulted in a serious loss of power by the feudal nobles. In 1176 he required that all earls, barons, knights, freeholders, and also villeins who wished to remain in the realm should take an oath of fealty to him. Thus he reinforced the law of William the Conqueror, which made all subjects responsible directly to the king and not to any intermediate lord. In 1181, by the Assize of Arms, every freeholder was required to supply himself with suitable arms and to serve when summoned. Thus a national army could be raised directly by the king. The laws of the second class established a system of royal courts, which left comparatively little power to baronial courts. Judges were sent throughout the country to try cases. In 1176 their jurisdiction was extended, and they were given fixed circuits. In 1178 5 judges were appointed to hear appeals at Westminster. From these the modern Court of the King's Bench developed. Henry was interested mainly in his continental possessions, and of the 35 years of his reign he spent only 13 in England. Richard I, who succeeded him, 1189 to 1199, was in England only 10 months in all. John's tyranny and misrule, 1199 to 1216, alienated everyone. In addition, the loss of his continental possessions in 1204, the defeat at Bouvines in 1214, and his troubles with the Pope weakened him. His successor, Henry III, 1216 to 1272, was unable to govern the realm. Consequently, in spite of the energetic measures of Henry II, the English nobles and people had a long period in which to develop their strength, and when a really capable king, Edward I, 1272 to 1307, came to the throne, the nation had secured certain rights which the monarch was obliged to respect. These rights had been obtained mainly by the struggle for the charters. In 1215 the estrangement of the nation from John became so great that the barons met together and, led by Stephen Langton, compelled the king to sign the Great Charter. This contained few if any new principles, but was merely a statement of the rights formerly enjoyed by the subjects. Freedom of election to church offices was confirmed, feudal exactions were restricted, courts were to be held at fixed times and places, freemen were not to be imprisoned or punished except in accordance with the law of the land. John was forced to dismiss his mercenaries and to consent to the appointment of a commission of 25, 24 barons and the mayor of London, who should see that these provisions were observed. When the Pope annulled the charter and suspended Langton, the barons offered the crown to Louis, the son of the King of France. John's death saved the kingdom for his son, Henry III., whom the nobles preferred to a foreign ruler. For 11 years during Henry's youth, the government was directed well by the king's ministers, but they had to struggle against the Queen Mother's foreign favourites, who received many appointments in England. From 1227 to 1258, Henry ruled in person and aroused opposition from his subjects by his incapacity, by his preference for foreigners, and by his demands for money. In order to obtain funds, he confirmed the charter repeatedly, but never kept his promises. In 1258, when Henry demanded an enormous sum of money for the Pope, the Mad Parliament met, headed by Simon de Montfort, brother-in-law to the king and the son of Montfort, the leader of the Albigensian crusade. This parliament drew up the Provisions of Oxford, which ordered the expulsion of all foreigners and transferred the government from the king to the barons. Dissensions, however, soon arose among the latter, and the king was able to regain his authority for a time. As he did not observe the provisions, Earl Simon took up arms against him. After a few months a truce was made, but the war soon broke out again. Simon was slain in 1265, and his associates surrendered in the following year. But in 1267 Henry was compelled to grant almost all the reforms which the Mad Parliament had asked. In 1265 Simon had called together a parliament to which, besides the clergy and the nobles, who were of his party, representatives of the shires and burghers from certain cities and boroughs had been summoned. He took this step in order to gain support. At first this innovation bore little fruit, but in 1295, when Edward I needed the aid of all his subjects, he summoned the Model Parliament. This consisted of tenants-in-chief, representatives of all classes of the clergy, knights of the shire, and 2 citizens from each city or borough. As Edward said in his summons, what affects all should be approved by all. Thus the English Parliament was established in the form which it retained until the 19th century. Moreover, Edward was obliged in 1297 to agree to the principle that no general contribution should be exacted from his vassals without the consent of Parliament. Edward I was able and energetic, a great contrast to his father and also to his son. His wars, his resistance to the demands of the Church, and his Model Parliament have been mentioned. In addition, he passed a long series of laws which diminished the power of the feudal nobles and established order in the realm. The assize of arms was renewed, the process of sub-infeudation was restricted, thus preventing a multiplication of feudal duties. An investigation was made to see by what right nobles exercised their judicial and administrative authority. Merchants were protected and commerce encouraged. Liberal charters were granted to towns, and Magna Carta was confirmed. In short, on the one hand, he restricted the authority of the barons. On the other, he fostered the welfare and prosperity of the merchants. Edward II, 1307 to 1327, was a weak king, and his reign lessened the royal authority which his father had done so much to establish. For a few years he governed by the aid of his favourite, Gaviston, who was hated by the people. In 1311 the barons wrested the power from Edward and compelled him to dismiss his favourite. In the following year Gaviston returned and was executed by the barons, who, except for a short period, kept the power until 1322. Then Edward recovered his authority and ruled with his new favourites, the Despensers. In 1327 the Queen, supported by the nation, compelled the king to abdicate and put the Despensers to death. These 20 years of misrule enabled the barons, who were the leaders of the nation, to weaken the royal authority and assert the rights of the subjects. Thus the course of events in these centuries led to results in England which differed widely from those attained in France. In the latter country, the Capetians at the beginning of the 12th century had little authority, and only a small territory under their immediate sway. At the beginning of the 14th, the French kings ruled almost all of France with an absolute government. In England, on the contrary, at the opening of this period, the kings were absolute and had enormous territories in France and England. In 1327 their French estates, with a few exceptions, had been lost, and their subjects had compelled them to recognize that the royal prerogatives were limited by the rights of the people.